They called her the most beautiful woman in Hollywood. Gene Tierney had the kind of face that seemed sculpted for the silver screen. Elegant, haunting, and impossible to forget. Directors adored her, fans were mesmerized by her, and her image became iconic overnight. But what no one saw, what the cameras never captured, was the relentless storm that raged behind those flawless features. Her life was not the fantasy people projected on her. It was a haunting mix of glamour, misfortune, and heartbreaking secrets that would have destroyed most people. Yet, Gene carried it all with a quiet dignity that only deepened the mystery. From the outside, Tierney's life looked like the ultimate Hollywood success story. A young woman from a wealthy East Coast family makes it big in Tinseltown, lands starring roles opposite the most famous actors of her time, and even scores an Oscar nomination early in her career. But success, especially in the studio era, was never just about talent. It was about image control, power plays, and silence. And in Tierney's case, that silence hid traumas that would later break through in devastating ways. She didn't choose fame as much as fame seemed to choose her. Even before she fully understood what she was walking into, producers had plans for her face, how it should look, what it should represent, and how they could profit from it. She was marketed like an untouchable goddess, but behind closed doors, Gene was deeply insecure. She hated her voice, felt trapped by her appearance, and quietly struggled with the immense pressure to live up to the persona studios built around her. They wanted her to be perfect, but perfection always comes with a cost. And yet, no one suspected what was really going on behind her sharp cheekbones and poised demeanor. The press marveled at her poise. Her fans sent her letters by the hundreds. No one knew that she was already beginning to unravel inside, battling emotions she couldn't name, feelings that would later be diagnosed as bipolar disorder after years of public breakdowns and brutal treatments. But all that was still ahead. In the beginning, it was all lights, cameras, and illusion. Gene Tierney's story isn't just a cautionary tale about fame. It's a stark look at how Hollywood once operated, how it prized beauty over well-being, silence over truth, and success over survival. Her life forces us to ask, how many stars have we admired while missing the pain beneath their glow? In Tierney's case, the pain wasn't just personal. It would soon become public, tragic, and impossible to ignore. But before the breakdowns, before the tabloid whispers, and the shocking hospital stays, there was the girl who came from privilege and stepped onto a movie set with the world at her feet. Her rise was meteoric, but as we'll see next, what seems like a dream at first can become a nightmare no one sees coming. Before she ever set foot on a movie set, Gene Tierney lived a life that already felt like a film. Born into privilege in Brooklyn in 1920, she was the kind of girl other people whispered about at parties. Her father was a successful insurance broker, her mother a former gym teacher with strict New England discipline. Gene was raised in the world of country clubs and finishing schools, fluent in French and trained to curtsy, not to act. Her destiny, according to everyone around her, was to become a wealthy man's charming, picture-perfect wife. But fate had something else in mind. Her entry into Hollywood wasn't planned. It was, in many ways, an accident. During a family vacation in California, Gene visited the Warner Brothers lot. Studio executives noticed her immediately. Not because she was pushing to be noticed, but because she simply couldn't be ignored. Even at 17, she carried herself with an otherworldly grace. Word spread fast. There was a new face in town, and it wasn't just pretty, it was unforgettable. She'd later write that she felt objectified that day, like a prize heifer at a cattle show. Still, the impact was made. The Tierneys weren't so easily impressed. Her father initially resisted the idea of acting, seeing it as beneath their social class. But when Gene expressed a real interest, combined with undeniable screen presence, he relented. He even helped bankroll her early career, forming a production company in her name. That decision would later haunt both of them. Jean began with stage work, cutting her teeth on Broadway. She quickly won over critics and the elite theater crowd. It wasn't long before Hollywood called again. This time, Fox's powerful studio chief, Darryl F. Zanuck, signed her to a long-term contract. From that moment on, she wasn't just a young actress with potential. She was a star in the making, and the machine behind her moved fast. The timing was perfect. The early 1940s were desperate for fresh talent, especially someone who didn't look like anyone else. Jean's beauty wasn't loud or obvious. It was icy, enigmatic, and timeless. She had a quiet intensity that pulled audiences in. Her early film appearances and the return of Frank James and Hudson's Bay didn't just introduce her. They proved she could hold her own opposite established male stars. The camera adored her, and so did the industry, but there was always a distance in her eyes, something slightly out of reach. People described her as aloof or difficult. The truth was, she was observing everything, calculating, cautious, never fully trusting the world she'd entered. She understood early that Hollywood was more dangerous than glamorous. The smiles weren't always sincere, and the praise came with expectations that were often suffocating. Behind her early success, the pressure to maintain her image began to build. She was still barely out of her teens, expected to carry films, charm the press, and remain flawless at all times. It was a game she played well, for a while, but the cracks in the surface were already forming. Fame had found her, fast and hard, but it wouldn't be long before it started taking from her just as quickly. And once she hit her breakout role, everything would change. Her face would become immortal. But the price of that kind of beauty, Hollywood's obsession with it, was more than anyone imagined. When Laura premiered in 1944, audiences weren't just watching a movie, they were falling under a spell. Gene Tierney didn't just play the title character, she became a cinematic obsession. Her portrayal of the elegant, enigmatic woman whose portrait haunts a detective blurred the lines between fiction and reality. That painting in the film wasn't just a prop. It symbolized everything Gene represented: beauty, mystery, and the haunting realization that something so perfect could never truly exist. From that moment on, she wasn't just a rising star. She was immortalized. Laura didn't just make her famous, it made her unforgettable. Critics praised her poise, her restraint, her ability to draw you in without saying much at all. That was the thing about Tierney. She could communicate volumes with a single glance. She didn't need dramatic outbursts or over-the-top emotion. Her stillness was more powerful. And in the midst of World War II, when the world was falling apart, that kind of poised beauty felt like a fantasy people desperately wanted to believe in. But she didn't stay confined to one role. Just 1 year later, in Leave Her to Heaven, 1945, Gene flipped everything on its head. Gone was the cool, tragic muse. In her place was a dangerously possessive woman named Ellen Barrett, a character so obsessive, so chilling, that she made audiences squirm. One moment, she was smiling softly. The next, she was watching a child drown, doing nothing. It was the kind of role that could ruin an actress's career. For Gene, it earned her an Academy Award nomination. That performance still shocks viewers today. Her ability to play calm while harboring something monstrous underneath was years ahead of its time. It was also, in a strange way, a reflection of what she was already living. On screen, she was mastering icy control. Off screen, her world was slowly unraveling. The pressure, the exhaustion, the emotional weight of Hollywood's expectations, it all hovered just beneath the surface. Between 1943 and 1946, she starred in a string of hits: Heaven Can Wait, The Ghost, and Mrs. Muir in Dragonwyck. Each role added a new layer to her persona. Sometimes she was angelic, other times sinister, but always there was that same eerie elegance. Audiences couldn't look away, even when they wanted to. Directors, photographers, even her fellow actors couldn't stop talking about her face. It was considered mathematically perfect, flawless from every angle. But perfection is a dangerous thing in Hollywood. It becomes a prison. Gene began to feel the weight of it. She hated her own voice, calling it like an angry Minnie Mouse. To change it, she chain-smoked between scenes, trying to deepen its tone. She was always trying to mold herself into what others wanted, what the industry demanded. And the more she tried, the more she lost pieces of herself. While the world saw a goddess on the screen, the woman behind the makeup and costumes was quietly breaking down. Her biggest performances were not in front of the camera. They were in pretending she was okay. And soon, tragedy would strike in a way that no script could ever predict. Because what happened next wouldn't just shatter her career, it would scar her for life. At the height of her fame, Gene Tierney had everything Hollywood claimed to offer: beauty, acclaim, and a future that looked untouchable. But beneath the glow of success was a silent war she hadn't chosen. And it all came crashing down with a single moment at a World War II USO event. It was 1943. Gene had taken a break from filming to support the troops, attending a Hollywood canteen event where she met dozens of soldiers, shook hands, and posed for photos. One fan in particular stood out, a young woman who had broken quarantine to meet her idol, despite having rubella, also known as German measles. She was sick, but desperate to see Gene face to face. That brief, seemingly innocent meeting would become the cruelest twist in Tierney's life. Shortly after, Gene fell ill. She recovered, but she didn't realize she had contracted rubella during the early stages of her pregnancy. Months later, she gave birth to a daughter, Daria, born severely disabled, blind, deaf, and with significant developmental issues. The child required full-time care for the rest of her life. Gene was only 24. The public didn't know the full story then. All they saw was a glamorous star back on screen, delivering hit after hit. But Gene was quietly drowning. She was overcome with guilt, grief, and rage, especially when, years later, she met that same fan again. The woman casually told her with pride that she had met Gene at the Hollywood canteen while knowingly carrying rubella. She said it had been worth the risk to meet her idol. Gene was shattered. That moment haunted her. It wasn't just the tragedy itself. It was the total lack of control. She had followed the rules, played the game, smiled for the cameras, and this was what she got in return. The emotional toll was brutal. Her marriage to fashion designer Oleg Cassini, already strained by career demands, began to crumble. She felt isolated, helpless, and angry at a world that only cared about her surface while her soul was caving in. Gene began to spiral. She couldn't concentrate on roles. She lost weight, lost interest, and sometimes even lost touch with reality. But because she was Gene Tierney, the perfect woman in the eyes of the press, no one suspected how close she was to the edge. She kept everything hidden. Hollywood didn't allow women to break down, not publicly, not without consequences. And yet, the cracks were widening. She would walk off sets, cancel appearances, and retreat from the spotlight. Friends noticed the change. Some whispered about a breakdown. Others assumed she was just being difficult. But inside, Gene was beginning to slip beyond the point of return. Her grief wasn't fading, it was consuming her. The same face that made her famous now felt like a mask. She couldn't show what was really happening behind it. Not yet. But soon, she wouldn't be able to hide it anymore. And the way Hollywood responded to her unraveling would be as cold as the studio lights themselves. By the late 1940s, the perfect image of Gene Tierney was starting to crack, and behind it was a woman in crisis. After years of keeping her pain hidden behind red lipstick and tailored gowns, her mental state began to collapse. The Hollywood goddess who had once mesmerized audiences with her icy beauty was now battling something she couldn't control. Something darker, more relentless, and far more real than any role she'd ever played. The loss of her daughter's health had never healed. Instead, It had burrowed deep, becoming a slow-burning torment. Gene suffered from severe depression, unpredictable mood swings, and debilitating anxiety. In private, she would disappear into silence, isolate herself from friends, and sometimes go days without eating. Her marriage to Oleg Cassini couldn't withstand the weight of the grief. By 1952, they divorced. She was left alone, emotionally and now, legally, navigating a system that had no room for the truth behind her glamorous persona. The studio system, built to sell fantasies, did what it always did with broken stars. It quietly distanced itself. Gene became unreliable on set, walking off productions or forgetting lines. She would vanish from public appearances, then reappear looking gaunt and disoriented. Rumors swirled, but no one dared speak directly about what was really happening. Mental illness was taboo, and for a woman, it was career-ending. Eventually, the walls closed in. In 1955, she voluntarily admitted herself to the Menninger Clinic in Kansas, one of the most respected psychiatric institutions at the time. Their doctors diagnosed her with what was then called manic depressive disorder, what we now know as bipolar disorder. But the treatment methods were brutal. Gene was subjected to 27 rounds of electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT, commonly known as shock treatments. These procedures, often performed without anesthesia, left her dazed, disoriented, and, at times, unable to remember basic details of her life. She later confessed that some memories were gone forever. "I was gone," she once said. "I had no soul, no thought, just empty." For someone who had once controlled every detail of her public image, the institutional years were devastating. She lost her autonomy, her voice, her sense of self. Her name vanished from casting lists. The media offered no sympathy. There were no headlines about her battle for stability, just silence. Hollywood moved on, and yet, even in her lowest moments, Gene fought to come back. She wrote poetry during her recovery, letters to friends she thought she'd lost, and tried desperately to hold on to the fragments of who she used to be. After several hospital stays and years in and out of treatment, Gene finally began to stabilize. But the cost of survival was enormous. By the late 1950s, she re-emerged, not as the flawless icon she once was, but as a woman marked by suffering, trying to find her way in a world that only loved her when she was perfect. The studios weren't calling anymore, but one unexpected source would give her a chance to reclaim her voice, and it wasn't Hollywood. Because just when it seemed like her story was over, fate would introduce someone who saw past the legend and changed everything. By the late 1950s, Gene Tierney had become a ghost of her former Hollywood self. Still beautiful, still recognized on the street, but no longer the woman staring back from silver screens. The studios that once chased her now avoided her, unwilling to risk casting someone marked by mental illness. For most stars, that would have been the final curtain. But Gene wasn't done yet. After years of battling inner demons, she began rebuilding her life in quiet, deliberate steps. She moved away from the chaos of Los Angeles and settled in Texas, far from the camera flashes and gossip columns. There, she found something she hadn't known since childhood: stillness. And in that stillness, the pieces of herself she thought were lost began to come back. But the comeback didn't start with film. It started with retail. In an almost surreal twist, Gene took a job as a salesgirl at a local dress shop in Houston. She wasn't recognized at first, until one customer looked closer and said, "You're Gene Tierney." Word spread quickly, and headlines soon followed: Hollywood star working in a store. But Gene didn't see it as humiliating. It was humbling, healing. For the first time, she was doing something normal, and it helped her reconnect to a version of herself untouched by fame. Still, she missed the work. Not the fame or the red carpets, but the art, the storytelling. So in the early 60s, with her health more stable and her mind clearer than it had been in years, she cautiously returned to the screen. It wasn't with a splashy role or a big studio deal. Her comeback was subtle, quiet. Supporting roles in Advise and Consent and Toys in the Attic reminded people of what she could do. And though she wasn't the ingenue anymore, she brought something deeper, a raw vulnerability that couldn't be faked. Then, something even more unexpected happened. She found love again, real, lasting love. In 1960, Gene met W. Howard Lee, a wealthy Texas oil man. He wasn't from Hollywood, wasn't dazzled by her fame, and had a quiet strength she admired. Coincidentally, he had been previously married to actress Hedy Lamarr, another beauty haunted by her own tragic legacy. But with Gene, it was different. Lee didn't see her as a broken star. He saw her as a woman who had survived the impossible. They married in 1960, and for the first time in decades, Gene had a partner who didn't expect her to be perfect, just honest. She would later say that those years, living in Houston with Howard, were the happiest of her life. No scripts, no camera crews, no pressure to be anyone other than herself. She gardened, she wrote, she spoke openly about her mental health, something few stars of her era ever dared to do. In 1979, her memoir Self-Portrait was published, laying bare everything Hollywood had tried to bury. It was raw, reflective, and years ahead of its time. Gene didn't write it to gain sympathy. She wrote it to be free. Because her true comeback wasn't in movies, it was in reclaiming her identity. After decades of being defined by beauty, scandal, and silence, Gene Tierney finally told her own story. But even that wasn't the final chapter, because there was still one legacy left to reshape: how the world remembered her. Gene Tierney lived long enough to witness the world change, and with it, how people spoke about beauty, fame, and mental health. But for decades, her story had been buried beneath a mask of perfection. Only in her later years did the truth begin to surface. And what emerged wasn't just the tale of a star who fell. It was something far more powerful: the story of a survivor. She never returned to major stardom, and she didn't want to. After marrying Howard Lee, she lived quietly in Texas, far from the flashing cameras and studio contracts. She appeared in a few interviews, made occasional public appearances, but mostly chose to stay out of the spotlight. Her life was now her own, and she guarded it fiercely. There was no more pretending, no more pressure to be the woman in the portrait from Laura. She was no longer a mystery. She was real. And that truth resonated. In 1979, when Self-Portrait hit shelves, it didn't make headlines for glamour. It shocked readers with its honesty. Gene detailed her battles with mental illness, her time in institutions, and the emotional wreckage of losing a child. In an era when no one, especially not women, spoke publicly about depression or bipolar disorder, Gene was one of the first to shatter the silence. She didn't hide behind euphemisms. She told the truth, even when it hurt. Her memoir became a quiet but powerful anthem for those struggling with invisible battles. For fans who had worshipped her on screen, the book offered something more valuable than elegance. It offered connection. And for those who had only known her as the face on a movie poster, Self-Portrait revealed the strength behind the softness, the fight behind the face. Gene's later years were marked by peace, but also by a kind of vindication. Film historians began to revisit her work with fresh eyes. Critics pointed out how ahead of her time she truly was, how her performances, often dismissed as cool or detached, were actually layered, restrained, and emotionally complex. She wasn't a product of the studio machine. She was someone who quietly rebelled against it, even when she didn't realize it herself. She passed away in 1991 at the age of 70, not with scandal or spectacle, but with dignity. And over the years, her story has only grown more relevant. Because in a world still obsessed with perfection, Gene Tierney stands as a reminder of its price and its illusion. Her legacy isn't just about one iconic face or one unforgettable film. It's about what that face had to endure behind the scenes, the truth she lived through, the silence she broke, the pain she carried so others wouldn't have to. Gene Tierney wasn't just a star. She was a woman who was almost destroyed by what made her famous, and who found her power in telling the truth behind it.